taking them a lot more seriously than the Kenyan politicians, the Kenyan policemen, the Kenyan civil servants who will end up enforcing them. One thing that struck me very much when this constitution was going to the vote in Parliament was that there had been 160 amendments which the MPs had put forward, and then suddenly at the end none of them were debated because everybody stood down and didn't want to go through with that debate. And I remember thinking, on the one hand you could see this as a fabulous example of consensus, and boy do we need it in Kenya, but on the other hand you could look at it and think they're just planning to have those debates and those wrangles and those arguments later on, one by one. They're going to have 160 squabbles. And they're not going to do it now, they're just going to do it later. I think the key issues are going to be, in putting this constitution into practice, the key issues are going to be money and violence. They always are in any society. The money thing is, of course, we have a certain amount of the pot that the Treasury is supposed to delegate to send off to these new counties that are going to be formed, 47. In DRC, for example, they had a semi-federal new constitution passed where mineral proceeds were supposed to have the same thing happening. There was going to be a lot more retained at provincial level. And my understanding is this has never happened. And because the money hasn't been there, then of course all the power leaches away, because if you don't have the money, you can't pay anybody, and you can't make the police behave properly, and you can't man your hospitals and pave your roads. So that's where the money issue comes in. The violence thing, I think, boils down to this very, very key issue, which I believe is only referred to in very vague terms of what happens to the administrative police, who many people will say are the real power in the land. This issue isn't really addressed, what happens to district commissioners. So I'd like a bit more specificity on those issues. Above all, having a new constitution is the beginning of a long path, but it doesn't deal with so many of the issues which John has already referred to, which are such major problems in Kenya. The militias haven't gone away. They've been armed. They've been armed more seriously. I mean, what I was hearing was that instead of having knives and bows and arrows, they have guns now, and that's a lot of that has happened since the very violent elections. We have the issue of the possible arrest warrants, well, certain arrest warrants to be issued by the International Criminal Court, which could cause all sorts of ructions. And then the issue of mutual ethnic hatred and suspicion, which ethnicity has always been as a toxic issue in Kenya, but never more so than after 2007. I think we just need to remind ourselves how often in Kenya constitutions get changed, and how, sorry, not in Kenya, in Africa, constitutions get changed. The many times in which very decent looking constitutions have been altered so the presidents can stand again when they were supposed to step down. I was asking Justin earlier, but neither of us know the precise answer, but I think it's either 40 or between 40 and 50 times that the constitution in Kenya was changed after independence to make it easier for the president to centralize power in his hands. Constitutions are mobile, they change. They're not fixed in cement. And I think you cannot expect a piece of paper to do the work of transforming a society. You have to transform a society and then enshrine it in a piece of paper. And there is a slight tendency to sort of hope that this constitution will do that very hard work that involves so much participation from so many quarters. And let's not forget that we are living here in a country that doesn't bother with the constitution, because the society has taken certain values on board pretty much, although we complain about so many aspects and are always whining about security in London. There are certain accepted truths, and therefore we don't have a constitution. So I think what I worry about, just to summarize, is that Kenya specializes in explosive crises, followed by very impressive promises to fix things, which involve brilliant, brilliant minds in Kenya. And then there's stasis, nothing happens, and things rot until then we have another crisis. And I really hope that doesn't happen with this constitution. But that is my fear. Thanks.
Michaela, thank you very much. So, my great pleasure to introduce Professor Willis for his comments on what John has said, or perhaps not said.
I should say that having been advertised as both unexpectedly fascinating and as an Anglo-Saxon legalistic mind, I'm a little bit anxious about your expectations. John Githongo has echoed Yash Gai in saying that this is an example of a constitution which has been imposed by the ruled upon the rulers. Well, yes and no. Undoubtedly, this is a constitution whose passage at the referendum was driven by an overwhelming popular desire for change. But we should remember that some of the details of the constitution are the result of negotiations at Naivasha, which were not at all to do with the popular desire for change. What happened at Naivasha was a series of political manoeuvrings, often driven not by principle, but actually by the attempts of individual politicians to outmaneuver one another on the basis of personal rivalry and future ambitions. So it's important to remember that while in some ways this may be a new beginning, actually an older politics is continuing in this process. Now that's important because, as both John Githongo and Michaela have pointed out, the Constitution does not in itself settle the future dispensation. What the Constitution does, in effect, is set out a set of principles, of guidelines almost, and a timetable. The detail has, to a considerable extent, been left to subsequent legislation. So while hopefully we are to have a robust legislature, as John has said, we're also going to have a very busy legislature. This is a substantial burden, and it should be remembered that aside from that set out in the schedules, there will also be a great deal of existing legislation which has to be overturned or amended in the light of the new constitution. In my own specialist field, just to give you an example, the new alcohol legislation, which received presidential assent just after the referendum, will have to be entirely rewritten as a result of the referendum. There is going to have to be a great deal of drafting of laws and introduction and implementation of new laws. And actually it is that process which is going to decide the real shape of Kenya's future. And as we have seen already over the judiciary, there is plenty of possibility for dispute over what the implications of the Constitution should be when it comes to the drafting of that detail. Michaela's a journalist, I'm a historian, and wearing my historian's hat, I should say that this process of the working out of detail is one which needs to be watched very carefully, because if we look at this from a historian's viewpoint, the Kenyan state has a persistent tendency towards centralization and administrative control, a tendency which is bequeathed by the colonial state. To illustrate this, we should remember that, again as Michaela has pointed out, people have been saying, oh, we are replacing the Lancaster House Constitution. But the Lancaster House Constitution is not really the one that's been replaced. The Lancaster House Constitution, remember, was the Majimbo Constitution. Majimboism was an agenda driven partly by some very murky forces, but it did offer a substantial degree of devolution. The rapid succession of changes in 1963 to 64, which did away with Majimboism before it had even started to function properly, were a result to a very large degree of that innate tendency to centralization which continues to grip the Kenyan state. And it is not just a matter of the decline of Majimboism which demonstrates this historically. Kenya came to independence with a system of local government which had been developed from the beginning of the early 1950s with elected local councils which had, at that stage, at independence, a considerable degree of revenue-raising authority of their own. Some Kenyans may still be old enough to remember GPT, the graduated personal tax, which was collected by councils at a local level.